He was the most loved man on the planet. Millions screamed his name. Women fainted at the sight of him. Men wanted to be him. An entire generation heard his voice and felt the earth shift beneath their feet. But here is the question nobody dares to ask. What does it do to a human being to be loved that much? Elvis Aaron Presley didn't die because he was forgotten. He died while the world was still obsessed with him. He died surrounded by people who needed him, fed off him, and called it love. The adoration that built his throne became the very thing that destroyed him. This is not a story about a rock star. This is a story about the unbearable weight of being needed by everyone and truly known by no one. The boy who didn't know he was different. Tupelo, Mississippi. January 8th, 1935. A baby boy was born in a 2-room wooden shack that cost his father, Vernon Presley, $180 to build, and that Vernon didn't even own. Elvis Aaron Presley entered the world alongside his twin brother, Jesse Garon, who was stillborn. From the very first breath, Elvis carried an invisible weight, the grief of a life that wasn't there, and the impossible pressure of being everything to parents who had already lost so much. Gladys Presley, his mother, wrapped that boy in a love so fierce it bordered on obsession. She walked him to school every day long past the age when other mothers stopped. She called him my baby until the day she died. And Elvis, who adored her right back, never fully learned how to exist without someone consuming him completely. Gladys didn't just love Elvis, she needed him. And so, from childhood, Elvis learned that love and need were the same thing. He was a strange, gentle boy, quiet in school, deeply religious. He sang in church before he sang on any stage. His voice, that extraordinary, once-in-a-century instrument, wasn't something he performed. It was something that poured out of him, uncontrollable and instinctive, like breathing. When he sang, the room changed. Teachers stopped talking. Students turned around. Even as a child, people couldn't look away, but he didn't know why. He genuinely didn't understand what he had. In high school, Elvis dressed differently. Pink shirts, pegged trousers, not to stand out, but because he couldn't afford not to have an identity. The kids mocked him. He was an outsider, a mama's boy, a poor kid from the wrong side of town. The same qualities that would one day make millions fall in love with him made his teenage years a quiet kind of lonely. That loneliness never left. It just changed shape. Later in life, when the screaming crowds faded after midnight and the last guest left Graceland, Elvis would wander the halls alone, unable to sleep, unable to be still. The boy who didn't know he was different grew into a man who was so different from everyone else, that real connection, the kind that has nothing to do with fame, became almost impossible. You cannot truly be seen by someone who is blinded by your light, and yet he kept searching. Every woman he fell for, every friendship he clung to, every late-night phone call to a gospel singer or a spiritual teacher, all of it was Elvis looking for the one thing his talent could never buy him, someone who loved him for the boy from Tupelo, not the king of rock and roll. July 5th, 1954. Sun Studio, Memphis, Tennessee. It was almost midnight. Elvis Presley, 19 years old, picked up his guitar and started playing That's All Right, an old Arthur Crudup blues tune, not as a performance, but as a joke. He was horsing around between takes, being silly, releasing tension. Producer Sam Phillips heard it from the control booth, leaned forward and said, "What are you doing?" Elvis stopped. "We don't know," said guitarist Scotty Moore. "Well, back up," said Phillips. "Try to find a place to start and do it again." That night, rock and roll was born. Not as a genre. It already existed in fragments, scattered across Black American music, but as a cultural earthquake. Elvis was the fault line where everything converged: country and blues, black music and white radio, sexuality and Sunday school, rebellion and tenderness. He wasn't just a singer. He was a collision. When the record hit Memphis radio, the DJ received hundreds of calls within the hour. Who is this? Is he black or white? Where can I see him? The hunger was instant, visceral, overwhelming. People didn't just like Elvis. They needed him in a way they couldn't explain. Teenage girls who had never felt understood heard his voice and wept. Boys who had been told to be small and obedient watched him move and understood freedom for the first time. Parents who felt exactly that danger called him the Devil. By 1956, Elvis was on television, and America lost its mind. The Ed Sullivan Show refused to show him below the waist, his hips, his pelvis, his whole electric, dangerous body, because what Elvis did physically was not just performance. It was liberation. He moved like a man who had never been told his body was shameful. In an era of rigid conformity, post-war repression, and racial segregation, Elvis Presley shook his hips on national television and told an entire generation, "You are allowed to feel this." The screaming that followed him everywhere was not mere excitement. It was release. It was years of suppressed feeling, erupting. Those girls weren't screaming at Elvis. They were screaming through him. He was the vessel, the channel, the permission slip. And the tragedy of that is this: when you are a vessel for other people's emotions, you risk losing track of your own. When the screaming never stops, when the need never ceases, when every room you enter becomes a congregation, you start to forget that you are also just a person. Elvis gave them everything they needed, and somewhere in that giving, he began to disappear. He bought Graceland in 1957. He was 22 years old and paid $102,500 for a white-columned mansion on a hill outside Memphis. He painted the walls gold and purple, installed a jungle room with a waterfall, and surrounded himself with the people he'd grown up with, his cousins, his childhood friends, the Memphis Mafia, a rotating circle of men who cooked for him, drove for him, laughed at his jokes, and never, ever told him no. Graceland was a dream. It was also a trap. Elvis rarely left. By the early 1960s, going out in public had become nearly impossible. A walk to a gas station could trigger a riot. A dinner in a restaurant would end in chaos. So instead, Elvis rented entire amusement parks for the night. He rented movie theaters at 3 a.m. and watched films alone with his entourage. He bought a fleet of Cadillacs and gave them away to strangers on impulse, because giving felt like the only human interaction that still made sense. The men around him enabled everything and challenged nothing. They took salaries from him, lived in houses he paid for, drove cars he bought. If Elvis wanted to eat 5 cheeseburgers at midnight, they got 5 cheeseburgers. If Elvis said he was fine when he was not fine, they agreed. This was not malice. This was survival economics. You don't bite the hand that keeps your family fed. But it meant that Elvis moved through his own life in a bubble of yes, a fortress of agreement, where the only voice he couldn't escape was the one inside his own increasingly troubled mind. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, made it worse. Parker controlled everything. He kept Elvis churning out mediocre Hollywood movies through the early 60s, 27 films in 10 years, because they were safe and profitable, even as Elvis begged to do real dramatic work. Parker reportedly couldn't leave the U.S. due to his own complicated immigration status, which is why Elvis never performed internationally, never toured Europe, never stood on a stage in front of the foreign millions who worshipped him from afar. The king of rock and roll was landlocked. And so, Graceland became the whole world. A kingdom with beautiful furniture, and gold-plated fixtures, and a man wandering through it at 4 a.m., unable to sleep, reading spiritual texts, calling friends, ordering food he wouldn't eat. The mansion that was supposed to be his reward became the clearest symbol of his captivity. You can be rich beyond imagination and still be a prisoner. You can have 1,000 people who love you and still be profoundly, unbearably alone. The '68 comeback special changed everything and nothing. Elvis stood before the cameras in black leather, 33 years old, leaner and fiercer than he'd been in years, and delivered a performance so raw and alive that it shocked even his most devoted fans. For 1 hour, the real Elvis reappeared. This was not the Vegas lounge act. This was the boy from Tupelo, stripped down and burning. But the machine had momentum that won television. Special couldn't stop. The Vegas residencies began in 1969, 57 consecutive sold-out shows, then hundreds more across the following years. 2 shows a night, a treadmill disguised as a triumph. And the audience that came to Vegas was not the screaming teenagers of 1956. They were middle-aged couples on package tours, conventioneers, tourists. They applauded warmly. They took photos. They loved him from a comfortable, air-conditioned distance. Elvis had always performed for the ones who screamed. Now he performed for the ones who clapped politely. And somewhere in that shift, something in him gave up. The prescriptions began to multiply. Dr. George Nicopolis prescribed thousands of pills over the final years of Elvis's life. Amphetamines to get up, barbiturates to sleep, painkillers for a body that had been thrown around stages for 2 decades. The medical establishment failed him catastrophically. The people around him, trapped in their financial dependency, could not or would not intervene effectively. There were attempts, family members who tried, friends who begged. Elvis listened, nodded, and continued. He gained weight. His face, once so sharp and beautiful, grew soft and swollen. He forgot lyrics on stage. He slurred between songs. Audiences watched with a mix of love and horror, loyalty and grief. Some cried. Some laughed nervously. Most sat very still, afraid of what they were witnessing. Unable to look away. In his final years, Elvis was reading constantly. The Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, books on spirituality and the afterlife. He was searching, with increasing desperation, for answers to questions he had been carrying since childhood. Why am I here? What is this for? Who am I when no one is watching? He gave away jewelry, cars, and money to complete strangers with a compulsiveness that looked less like generosity and more like a man trying to empty himself before the end. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was found unresponsive on the bathroom floor of Graceland. He was 42 years old. He was buried on the grounds of his mansion, inside the prison, at the end. The world that had consumed him wept, and then, almost immediately, began to sell him. The lesson the world won't learn: Elvis Presley did not die from drugs. He died from a specific kind of loneliness that only the excessively loved can understand. The loneliness of being a mirror for everyone else's desires, with no one left to show you your own reflection. We loved him. We really did. But we loved what he gave us more than we loved who he was. We loved the performance, the voice, the hips, the legend. We didn't love the insomniac wandering Graceland at midnight. We didn't love the frightened man reading about death in the dark. We loved Elvis the King. We never quite got around to loving Elvis the person. And that, more than any pill, more than any bad deal or corrupt manager, is what killed him. Did this story move you? Share it, because the world still hasn't learned how to love its kings without consuming them. Follow for more untold stories behind the legends.